Nigeria today stands at a troubling spiritual crossroads. On one side, the nation witnesses a surge of attacks against Christian communities. Churches are being raided, homes destroyed, and believers abducted or killed in various regions. Families gather for worship, not knowing if they will return home safely. In several states, attending church has become an act of courage rather than routine devotion. In the midst of this hardship, another narrative has captured public attention. Two of Nigeria's most influential pastors, Bishop David Oyedepo of Living Faith Church and Pastor David Ibiyeomie of Salvation Ministries, are making headlines. However, it is not for advocating against the violence or pushing conversations about the safety of Christians. Instead, it is for celebrating the construction of gigantic church buildings, each designed to accommodate tens of thousands of worshippers. These projects, remarkable in size and ambition, have ignited a national debate. Some view them as testimony to the strength of Christianity in Nigeria, a symbol of divine prosperity and faith-driven achievement.
The Ark Legacy Project. A raw testament of the move of God on the earth today. Raw testament. Raw testament.
Others, however, see them as a misalignment of priorities. They question whether this is the right time for such celebrations, while countless Christians are losing their homes, their loved ones, and in some cases, their lives. This controversial conversation raises a profound and painful question. Should spiritual leaders focus more on speaking out against violence and advocating for the safety of believers, rather than magnifying architectural accomplishments? Is the Church's mandate in a time of crisis to build structures, or to build protection and representation for its suffering members? This is the conflict shaping the national and spiritual discourse today. The church buildings that shocked Nigerians. Bishop David Oyedepo recently reignited public attention with the impending completion of the Faith Theatre, a colossal 100,000-seat auditorium located in Lagos State. The project, described by many as one of the largest Christian worship venues in the world, has been promoted as a milestone in African church architecture and capacity. Similarly, in Port Harcourt, Pastor David Ibiyeomie of Salvation Ministries unveiled his mega cathedral, another massive structure designed to accommodate thousands of worshippers. The building has been celebrated by members as a proof of divine favor, legacy, and the impact of their ministry. For supporters, these accomplishments reflect spiritual excellence. They see them as investments into the future of Christianity, a sign that the gospel will not be intimidated or suppressed. To them, building grand structures during turbulent times is an expression of faith that God's kingdom will continue flourishing regardless of national insecurity. Yet, critics raise serious concerns. They argue that the timing is insensitive. While bloodshed continues and Christian communities express fear, these grand announcements come across as disconnected from reality. For those who see loved ones murdered or are afraid to worship publicly, the message of massive investments in infrastructure can feel contradictory to the urgent needs of the season. The question critics are asking is not about whether churches should grow, but whether they should pause to prioritize advocacy. Should public influence be directed toward protecting lives rather than expanding worship seats? It is not a criticism of expansion, but of silence. Christianity under threat in Nigeria. Across multiple regions of Nigeria, Christians are living under intense pressure. In the north-central and northeastern parts of the country, extremist groups continue to target churches, pastors, and congregations. In rural communities, worship centers are burned and believers are attacked during services. Many are kidnapped, often held for ransom or killed when families cannot meet demands. Reports of abductions have become common headlines, and burial ceremonies are beginning to outnumber wedding celebrations in some communities. Entire villages have been displaced. In some areas, Christians no longer gather in large groups for fear of being detected. Farmers abandon their fields due to insecurity, leaving families not only unprotected but also hungry. In all of this, rural churches remain the most vulnerable. They lack security, legal support, and political representation. Many of these worship centers are built with mud blocks, lacking windows, metal doors, or fencing, making them easy targets for armed attackers. Government agencies often fail to respond or intervene, leaving communities with the feeling that they are alone. In the face of these realities, worshippers have begun asking questions. Why is the church silent? Where are the voices of the powerful ministers who command national influence? When leaders have the capacity to speak, advocate, and mobilize international pressure, is silence acceptable? Should prayers replace advocacy, or should both walk hand in hand? It is these unanswered questions that make the controversy surrounding giant church buildings even more intense. For many Nigerians, the discussion goes beyond structures. It touches on the value of Christian lives, the responsibility of spiritual leadership, and what it truly means to shepherd a nation in a time of crisis. After the warning, Trump's November intervention. In early November 2025, the issue of Christian persecution in Nigeria drew international spotlight when US President Donald Trump reportedly issued a stern warning and raised concerns about what he described as a creeping genocide against Nigerian Christians. According to global commentary circulating in diplomatic and religious networks, Trump urged Nigerian authorities and international observers to pay close attention to the alarming trend of targeted violence affecting Christian communities. His intervention reawakened global scrutiny and intensified demands for accountability. Many Nigerians expected that such a statement from a world figure with significant influence would trigger loud and coordinated reactions from major church leaders, especially those with international recognition like Bishop David Oyedepo and Pastor David Ibiyeomie. Pastors of such prominence are not just spiritual leaders, they are also public figures whose words carry weight across borders. It was assumed that they would seize this opportunity to amplify the warning, demand protection for Christian communities, and pressure the Nigerian government to take immediate action. Instead, the reaction from the top tier of Nigerian Christianity remained notably muted. Public advocacy was almost non-existent. There was no collective statement from prominent pastors, no unified demand from mega ministries, and no major press conferences addressing the issue. The only expression of concern came indirectly through prayers during services, framed as general intercessions for Nigeria rather than specific calls for intervention. This silence has fueled the debate. Some view it as diplomacy rooted in caution. Others see it as avoidance. The aftermath of Trump's warning highlighted a disturbing gap between international concern and domestic advocacy from those who lead the nation's largest Christian communities. The question remains unresolved. Is this silence strategic, spiritual, or simply neglect? Are Nigerian pastors too quiet? To answer this, it helps to look at history. In earlier decades, African church leaders were central voices in political, social, and human rights advocacy. Figures like Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa used their pulpits to confront oppression head-on. They challenged both government and society. They risked their reputations, their comfort, and even their lives. Today, however, many Nigerian pastors are noticeably silent on national crises, especially those involving government responsibility. They rarely confront political leaders or demand justice publicly. Instead, they lean heavily on prayer, prophetic statements, and calls for divine intervention. As tragic events unfold, their platforms are largely used to encourage faith, rather than confront systems. Critics argue that this silence is driven by fear. They suggest that pastors worry about losing political connections, government favors, or access to resources. They fear being targeted by authorities or losing influence that benefits their institutions. In times when arrests and political retaliation are real possibilities, many choose caution. Others defend their approach, insisting that they are not avoiding responsibility but choosing prayer over confrontation. They argue that intercession is a higher and more effective response than activism. They believe that the church's role is to influence heaven, not challenge earthly systems through public noise. Yet, this raises a troubling dilemma. Where is the balance between spiritual leadership and social responsibility? Should Nigerian pastors maintain quiet diplomacy, or should they lift their voices like the prophets of old? Is silence a form of spiritual wisdom, or is it gradually becoming a passive neglect that costs lives? As Christian communities continue to suffer, this question grows more urgent. In times of national crisis, can the shepherd remain silent while the sheep bleed? Should mega churches prioritize security over structures? As multi-billion naira church projects rise into the skyline, critics argue that the focus of mega ministries should shift away from physical expansion towards safety and advocacy. Many wonder why churches invest vast resources in architectural marvels while entire congregations across rural Nigeria remain vulnerable and defenseless. If churches possess the financial capacity to build 100,000-seat auditoriums, critics ask why that same capacity cannot establish national networks for security support, crisis response, legal defense, and international lobbying. A unified coalition of churches could pressure the government, protect endangered communities, and collaborate with global human rights organizations. Several suggestions have been raised by analysts and concerned believers. First, create a national church security blueprint, developing protocols, training, and support systems to protect worshippers, especially in volatile regions. Second, form a coalition of influential churches to engage directly with policymakers and international agencies. Major ministries could leverage their platforms to draw attention to attacks and demand accountability. Third, invest in legal advocacy units to represent victims' families, support court cases, and pursue justice when authorities fail to intervene. Fourth, allocate funds to community fortification projects, such as securing church buildings, providing emergency infrastructure, and supporting displaced Christian families with shelter and food. These proposals do not reject building projects outright. They simply argue that human lives must be valued above architectural ambition. When worshippers are endangered, structural grandeur without security appears hollow. The church's greatest investment should not be in concrete, steel, and lead screens, but in the preservation and dignity of the people who gather inside. Thus, as the debate continues, the underlying truth becomes clearer. Beautiful cathedrals cannot worship God if the worshippers are dead. The call is urgent. The priority must shift. Nigerian Christians are not asking for less faith. They are asking for protection, advocacy, and the assurance that their lives matter more than megaprojects. Oyedepo and Ibiyeomie, symbols of a divided view. Bishop David Oyedepo and Pastor David Ibiyeomie have long been seen as towering figures in Nigerian Pentecostalism. Their ministries represent influence, wealth, and architectural excellence. With their recent cathedral projects, many of their followers interpret these structures not simply as buildings, but as monuments of faith. They view them as testimonies of God's greatness and symbols of economic empowerment that showcase what believers can achieve through divine provision. For supporters, these cathedrals inspire believers to dream big, build boldly, and invest confidently in the kingdom. But the same projects have ignited a very different reaction among critics. They argue that while beautiful and impressive, the timing creates a sharp contradiction. How can the most influential church leaders celebrate grand accomplishments when Christians across the country are facing unprecedented attacks? To many, these new edifices appear like gleaming monuments overshadowed by the silent cries of vulnerable believers in villages, towns, and rural worship centers that lack even basic security. The silence of these pastors on the ongoing religious crisis adds tension to the debate. Neither Oyedepo nor Ibiyeomie has issued strong public statements outside of general prayers. Their refusal to directly address the crisis leaves room for speculation. Some interpret it as caution. Others call it indifference. Their silence does not just exist in a vacuum. It shapes public expectations of what leadership should look like when danger looms over the church. Thus, these two leaders have unintentionally become symbols of a divided national conversation. What matters more in this moment, cathedrals or courage? What should the church do next? As the debate grows louder, Nigerians are no longer only questioning individual pastors, they are challenging the entire structure of church leadership. Many believe that the future will demand more than Sunday sermons, worship concerts, or mega buildings. It will require strategy, courage, collaboration, and advocacy. To protect and preserve Christian communities, several actions have been proposed as urgent necessities. First, Nigerian churches must form strong alliances with global Christian organizations and human rights groups. International attention can place pressure on governments to respond. The global body of Christ has influence and resources that can amplify local voices. Second, there must be a nationwide security initiative for churches. Ministries could collaborate to fund training, early warning systems, crisis response networks, and community defense strategies, especially in high-risk regions. Protecting worshippers must become a coordinated mission, not the responsibility of individual churches fighting alone. Third, the church must use its massive media influence to shape public conversation. Nigerian mega ministries own television stations, radio networks, publishers, and social media platforms with millions of followers. If these platforms speak boldly, they can pressure policymakers, expose negligence, and demand accountability. Fourth, unity must be restored among denominations. Too often, churches operate in silos. Instead of defending one another, they compete for members, influence, and prestige. In times of persecution, division becomes a luxury the church cannot afford. Unity must go beyond joint prayers, it must evolve into joint action. These steps represent more than activism, they represent responsible leadership. They honor the lives of believers, protect the mission of the church, and ensure that the gospel is not overshadowed by bloodshed. A call for a united Christian voice. As Nigeria navigates one of its most challenging spiritual crises, the responsibility of Christian leadership becomes clearer. The church must be more than an institution that builds structures. It must be a community that protects its people. Cathedrals are meaningful, but the lives of believers are priceless. Faith must not only manifest in architecture, but in advocacy. Christian voices must not only rise in worship, but in justice. What Nigeria needs today is a united Christian voice, loud enough to defend the oppressed, courageous enough to confront injustice, and compassionate enough to respond to suffering. The future demands that the church stand as both a spiritual force and a protective refuge. The question that remains is simple, yet profound. Will Nigerian church leaders speak louder for the lives of believers than for the size of their buildings? Until this question is answered, the nation watches, the church listens, and vulnerable worshippers wait.